Good evening. Welcome to this evening's webinar on the EU Falsified Medicines Directive, 3 weeks to go. So before we get started, if you do have any technical problems, please do use the questions box to contact us, and we will try to help you and get the technical problem sorted out. So tonight's webinar is being recorded. It will become available almost immediately using the same logins that you've used to get on to this evening. So if you do have any technical problems that can't be resolved, or you have to leave before the end, then you should be able to come back and view the recording of the webinar. And if you do have any questions about the content of the webinar, please ask them as we go through. So there is a questions box on your screen, or there should be, and we'll come to those at the end, and we will answer as many of those questions as we can at the end. And if we do run out of time or can't answer questions, we will deal with this after the webinar and circulate a full list of answers as soon as possible. Okay, so firstly I'd like to introduce myself. So my name's Gareth Jones, Head of Corporate Affairs here at the MPA. So I've had some involvement with FMD for almost 10 years now, firstly working with our sister pharmacy organisations around the EU as this directive was considered in the European Parliament, and latterly working with pharmacy bodies, the MHRA and DH, on implementation in the UK. And I'm joined this evening by John Palmer, who's the MPA's Pharmacy IT Policy Lead, who has an IT background and has been working on community pharmacy IT policy for a number of years, and particularly on FMD, particularly over the last couple of years. So thank you, first of all, for joining us this evening. Obviously, there are momentous events unfolding in Westminster as we speak, and the outcome of the Brexit process will obviously affect all parts of life across the UK, but actually implementation of the EU Falsified Medicines Directive will be one of the more immediately impacted areas. So we will cover Brexit later on in the webinar, but what I will say at this point is that Brexit creates huge uncertainty in relation to FMD, but ultimately the most likely scenario is that we will implement in the long term the current Falsified Medicines Directive, or something quite similar. I think it's pretty unlikely that we will not have anything at all after this process, and also because it would leave the UK exposed as with other countries having anti-counterfeiting system and us not having one. So Brexit will create a lot of questions, but ultimately I think it won't stop us, whatever path Brexit takes, it won't stop us from having some sort of system in place. So just to deal with a little bit of the background before I hand over to John to talk through the detail, whilst there have been few cases of counterfeit medicines reaching the legitimate supply chain in the UK and other EU countries, there have been enough for it to be a cause of concern. There was a spate in the UK just over 10 years ago. There have been counterfeits in France and Germany in the last 5 years. And the impact on the end user is potentially very significant. Counterfeiting is often, when we talk about the counterfeiting, we're often thinking about products like fake handbags or alcohol. But when it comes to medicines, there is a patient safety issue, and we can't argue with regulations that seek to ensure that the medicines that we give to patients are as safe as possible. However, many will argue that FMD is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, that it's perhaps disproportionate. However, that is the law, and we do have to comply. So FMD includes regulations of websites, and that includes the logo. So if anybody sells medicines online anywhere in Europe, they now have to get a logo to display on their website, and that's been a requirement for 2 or 3 years now. The directive regulates medicine brokers, serialization of products, tamper evidence packaging on packages, and also the authentication process in pharmacy. It is law already in Europe, and today I believe, although I haven't seen this has definitely happened, the regulations were meant to be laid before the UK Parliament, so that confirming that the serialisation and authentication requirements of community pharmacy will be law by the 9th of February. So that is only 3 weeks on Saturday, so not long to go. So I'll now hand over to John to cover some of the detail, and then at the end we've got some questions, frequently asked questions, and then the questions that are being put onto the system as we talk. We'll deal with those at the end of the webinar. So I'll now hand over to John to go through the detail of the system.
Thank you, Gareth. So, hi, I'm John Palmer, and I'm Pharmacy IT Policy Lead. So, let's look first at the FMD fundamentals. The EU Falsified Medicines Directive 2016/161 comes into force on the 9th of February, and it requires you to check the FMD safety features of prescription-only medicines, plus also omeprazole when sold in a pharmacy. The checks need to be performed by an electronic system as it links to a database. Now, we covered the background of FMD in a webinar earlier, so that's available on the MPA website. So I'm not going to go through all of the background to FMD. So the safety features that FMD adds are the tamper evidence seal and the unique identifier. So on the left-hand side, we have the tamper evidence seal, of which there may be various types. This is just one tear strip that's being shown, and those need to be tested visually or by touch. And then on the right-hand side, we've got that the unique identifier, which is represented by the data held in that two-dimensional data matrix barcode. This is printed on a low reflectivity background to make it easier to scan. The FMD data matrix contains 4 pieces of data. It contains the product number, the batch, the expiry date, and the serial number. These, between them, form the unique identifier. And those pieces of data are also written in human-readable form on all but the smallest of packs. It's important to note that if a pack doesn't have these safety features, that is, it doesn't have the tamper evidence seal and the unique identifier, the data matrix on a low reflectivity background, then it isn't FMD stock. So it doesn't need to be scanned. You just carry on as you do now. So let's have a look at the question of pharmacy workflow. So FMD says that you need to check the safety features and decommission the unique identifier at the time of supply to the public. There is some leeway in time of supply, and that's described in full in the way forward document, which is also available on the MPA website. In terms of workflow, you have some choices to make. You may choose to verify the safety features when the packs enter the pharmacy, and verifying the safety features at that stage gives you some assurance that they're less likely to fail later on in the process, maybe at an inconvenient moment when handing over to a patient, say. You may choose to verify the safety features during or soon after assembly. But what you must do is that before you supply to the public, you must have checked the anti-tamper device and have decommissioned the unique identifier using an electronic system. You can reverse the decommissioning to put, say, uncollected items back into stock in most cases, but only within 10 days. That assumes, for instance, that the stock hasn't expired in the meantime. So many people will choose to do a verify scan during assembly, and will use that data and put it into an aggregate barcode and put that on the bag, which will then be scanned to decommission all of the bag contents at handover to the patient, so-called aggregation. I think it's important to point out at this stage that the word decommissioning, decommissioning a pack just marks it as used on the database. That is, normally that just means that the pack's been dispensed, but it could also be marked as decommissioned if, for instance, the manufacturer had marked the pack as stolen. So are you going to upgrade your PMR to do FMD, or are you going to use a standalone solution? Probably the first step is to ask your PMR supplier what the costs are to add the FMD functionality to your existing PMR. And in terms of the advantages of having FMD within your PMR system, it's likely that such a solution would use aggregate codes on the bags to ease decommissioning. It maintains a relationship with your PMR supplier and doesn't bring in any extra system suppliers. With an FMD solution built into a PMR, there's a possibility that it can do an accuracy check for safety back to the prescription at the time of handover to make sure you're giving the patient what was on the prescription. Some of the systems may have that feature now, and others may add it at a later date. On the negative side, it might be more expensive or require a long contract, and it could necessitate alterations to your medicine assembly processes. And of course, you may need more PMR terminals. There's a full list of suppliers, both PMR and standalone, on the FMD source website at the URL given at the bottom of the page. So what about standalone FMD systems? There are many to choose from. They may be less expensive. They may affect the assembly process less. But on the downside, they probably require extra power sockets and network connections. They're unlikely to provide accuracy checks back to the prescription. It may introduce another IT supplier into the pharmacy. And there might be an additional cost if you later decided to move from standalone back to an FMD capable PMR. So let's talk about procurement now. So obviously it's important to check that your potential system does what you want for FMD, but it's also important to use this contract checklist, and I've pulled this from choosing a PMR system on the MPA website. So you have to ask yourselves, what's the contract length? Does it include everything you expect in terms of hardware, software, network connection, and support? You mustn't be bounced into signing a contract, and obviously it's important to read the contract in detail, looking out for tie-in clauses and penalties if you decide that you need to exit the contract early. Look for break clauses. Does the contract give you sufficient assurance of service quality and continuity? And if you agree any verbal changes, it's vital to have them written into the contract, not to just trust the salesperson. Also watch out for rollover terms and make a diary date of when you need to think about the contract again. And if you're in any doubt, you should feel free to contact our MPA legal team at the email address given in the slide. Now, those contract procurement contract checklist was written with PMR procurement in mind, but it applies almost identically to a standalone FMD system. And in both cases, you ought to ensure that that there's a clause in the contract somewhere that says that you're allowed to extract your data when eventually you leave your new supplier. A so-called sunset clause makes things a lot easier. So when you know which system you're going to be using, and not before, you'll be able to do the end user registration at SecureMed. Now, the registration can take a while. It can involve using the postal service where your identity is checked by sending you a letter, and your system suppliers may be able to help you with the registration. It depends which system supplier you use for your FMD system. Something that's worth noting is that if you're a community pharmacy that also has a wholesale license, you need to register with SecureMed twice, once in your community pharmacy capacity and once in your wholesale license capacity. So one of the things you'll need to do is to update your standard operating procedures to include FMD. So to help with this, the MPA has modified its template SOPs to include FMD within them, and many of the MPA SOPs are affected. There's also important information that you can glean by looking at the FMD source, FMD scanning and error messages page, which talks about the types of warning or messages you get back from the system. And also the RPS has issued some professional guidance on what you can do in maybe the more difficult areas and errors where there's an ethical dimension. So go live is the 9th of February, and so far there are only 12.5 million packs in the system, and around 254 of them have been decommissioned, a very minor number so far. It's going to be a slow ramp up, and old stock can still be traded and dispensed until it expires. So old stock is going to be in the system for a long time yet. And manufacturers also get 6 months of leeway after registering their new FMD pack artwork, during which time they can still manufacture the old style packs without the safety features. So 6 months as well there. It's important to note the error messages in the references I gave on the last slide. So FMD scanning can give a green light for OK, an amber warning, and red for an error, although it may vary between systems. Clearly green is good. Amber is fine too in almost all cases, but for red, you're not going to be able to dispense the pack, and you may need to report it to the MHRA by phone or using the yellow card portal. And I'd now like to hand over to Gareth to speak about the Brexit dimension.
Okay, thank you, John. So, yes, Brexit has made implementation of FMD a real challenge, and as we've been talking, Prime Minister's been defeated in Parliament by a huge majority, which probably makes the uncertainty even greater because it's so much more difficult to see where all of this is heading. So the Brexit uncertainty created delays in the establishment of the secure med database. So that's the database that sits behind all of this and holds all the unique numbers. And it does leave community pharmacies wondering whether to commit to expenditure when there is a real possibility of the FMD system being switched off 7 weeks after implementation. So if there's a no-deal Brexit on the 29th of March, the database will be switched off, so we won't be able to use it. So that is the situation in the probably still unlikely event of a no-deal Brexit. So the UK government position is that we should comply on the 9th of February 2019 because we are without doubt at that point members of the EU and therefore have the obligation to meet all EU regulation. And actually, UK government position has been to try to ensure that the UK stays part of the medicines regulatory system that the EU operates. So that includes the European Medicines Agency, the pharmacovigilance systems, the medicines regulation system. So, government policy is, whilst we are leaving the EU, to try to hold on to regulations like FMD. And so they're very keen to show the EU that we are complying with these sorts of regulations. So if the withdrawal agreement is eventually ratified, and that proposes a transition period currently up until December 2020, the obligation to comply with FMD will just carry on as normal. And if Article 50 is delayed, which is looking increasingly likely, then we will still be full members of the EU, and therefore we will have to comply with FMD. So yes, it is the no-deal Brexit scenario where FMD would be switched off, but it's still, despite everything that's happening, still not the most likely outcome. So it is at a time when community pharmacy has under huge financial pressure. It's entirely understandable that people don't want to spend money on a system that may become obsolete very quickly. Now, we have discussed this dilemma with the relevant regulators and Department of Health, and they all recognise the problems that Brexit has caused. Every indication that we have from them is that they will enforce this regulation pragmatically at the start. And I mentioned earlier on the website logo that anybody that sells medicines online across Europe has had to apply for and then display a logo for 2 or 3 years now. And to my knowledge, MHRA has never resorted to prosecution for people who haven't actually displayed that logo. They've talked to them, they've written to them, they've encouraged them to comply, but they haven't taken the ultimate steps of criminal prosecution. Several years later, we know a lot of people weren't complying at the start. So there is a track record here of enforcing regulations pragmatically. The law will come into place. There's no doubt about that. But enforcement is a different matter. But that doesn't mean that you can get away with doing nothing. Absolutely not. I think if you do nothing, you're taking a huge risk. This is a law. The ultimate sanction is a couple of years in prison for non-compliance. So we certainly wouldn't recommend ignoring this, despite everything that's going on. I think the regulators will definitely expect to see that people are making progress towards compliance, to probably have got the SOPs in place, to if they haven't quite got a system, at least to have chosen a system and have ordered it. So I think the position, the position is here. You do have to comply, but I think enforcement may not be very strict at the start. So I think you might have a little bit of breathing space. provided that you show you are on a clear path towards implementation of FMD by the 9th of February. So I'll now hand back over to John, who's got a couple of Q&As that we put up before the start, and then we've got a lot of questions that are coming whilst we've been talking, and we'll go through those in a second.
Right, so here we go. Had a question about, will patients have access to see if their medicines are falsified online? And the answer is no. So unlike some of the other systems around the world where people can maybe use their mobile phone to check whether a pack is legitimate or not, this will be a system which is secure and protected and only accessible to users and establishments which have been certified by SecureMed as people who are proper to connect to it. So no, patients don't have access to this information. However, they may notice packs being scanned in dispensaries, and they may ask what's going on. And so I go on to the next question, which is, are there any materials to inform patients what's going on and what the 2D barcodes are? And the answer is that I haven't seen any yet, but I'm hoping that the NHS will be providing some, and I guess if they don't, we'll have to provide something. But I'm pretty confident that they will be, because of the number of venues that FMD applies to. I've had some questions about FMD IT. FMD IT is a business partner of the MPA and is one of the standalone solutions that's available. So the question was, what happens, what are the Brexit terms that apply to that contract? So the supplier tells me that there's a non-refundable deposit of £75, plus anything you pay to purchase hardware, that's yours to keep but is not returnable. But regarding Brexit, essentially in the event of no EU or UK workable FMD system, the contract for the license and support fee of £25 per month is cancelled with immediate effect once terminated in writing. And if you want to see there's a URL there for the rest of the details on that offering. And the other question I had about that is, what's the lead time for that solution? And it's 2.5 weeks at present, but of course it might be expected to stretch out a bit if demand increases. So now if we look and see what other questions have come in.
Yeah, okay. So I'll pick up some of the questions we've had through this evening. So existing stock is the first question. So existing stock is fine. Anything that's in the pharmacy on the 9th of February is absolutely fine. Carry on using it as before. There's no change. And in fact, we know that it'll only be a tiny proportion of the stock that you have now, and for some period that will even be able to be scanned and will be within the scope of FMD. There will be stock coming through wholesalers for months, if not years, that won't be compliant. So John mentioned about 12 million packs in the database at the moment. We know several billion packs go through the UK every year. So that confirms at the moment that very little stock within the system is compliant. So existing stock, it's fine to carry on, and also stock that you receive that is out of scope of FMD that doesn't have the barcode or the tamper evidence seal, you don't need to scan it. You can dispense it in the normal way. We've got a question about the penalties. I did touch on that. There are serious criminal penalties that will be in law by the 9th of February. I mean, it's usual in the Medicines Act to have a penalty of up to 2 years in prison for non-compliance with medicines regulations. That ultimate power is it will be reused in very rare circumstance. The MHRA, which is the main regulatory body here and enforcing body, is quite clear that they would look to advise people initially if they were non-compliant, and criminal action is absolutely the sort of last course that they would take, but they have those penalties if people absolutely refuse to comply. They have those penalties that they can ultimately enforce. From the GPHC perspective, so they will regard compliance with FMD as being something that is one of the many things that they will look at when they're inspecting pharmacies. And they've also indicated that they understand the challenges and are unlikely to be responding very strongly right at the start. But as I say, you have to be. This is a law. It will be in place on 9th of February, and it does have real penalties, albeit people understand the challenges of getting this up and running.
Can I just take the question on, I ordered my scanners and accompanying software from Cegedim, but I still haven't received it. How am I meant to practice beforehand so that I make sure there's no disruption? Well, I think you've done well to choose a system and to plan to put it in place. And I think that your order to the PMR supplier is a sign of your good faith for any regulators that come calling. I think that there's bound to be some disruption and delay as people try and put the systems into place. And I think that the important thing, as you say, is not to let chaos reign in the dispensary and to try and make sure that it goes in an orderly fashion with the SOPs being updated appropriately. So as Gareth said, I think that the regulators have already indicated that they acknowledge it's going to be a slow ramp up with FMD stock only becoming available in the months and years that follow the implementation date. So I think that's fine. I don't think there's any real cause for concern there.
Okay, so I'll take a question here about funding. Obviously, an important question: who's going to fund this? This is a regulatory requirement, and so it's reasonable to expect that as part of our contractual agreements across the 4 parts of the UK that the NHS should be covering at least some of the costs of implementing FMD. The situation, as we understand it, and having spoken to other pharmacy organisations in the last couple of days, is that Northern Ireland appears to be the only place thus far that has had any real discussions about funding. So I think there's been an offer in Northern Ireland to pay pharmacies £3,000 towards implementation. The discussions haven't taken place in England, so negotiations aren't actively underway in England. So that's an issue that we know the PSNC will be taking to NHS England and the Department of Health, but it hasn't been dealt with yet. And again, in Wales and Scotland, there doesn't seem to be any progress. But certainly the position of all the pharmacy bodies is that this is a regulatory burden. It's a considerable cost to community pharmacy. It's easier in some way to quantify the cost of the scanners and the software in the pharmacy. Of course, there are training costs as well. There will be staffing costs, the time to actually do these scans. The system will create problems that have to be dealt with, and that will require more staff time. And the system could actually increase waste in pharmacy if there are packs that we can't do anything with. So it's difficult to fully quantify what the cost of implementing this will be at this particular time. But certainly MPA, and I'm sure the other pharmacy bodies will be trying to gather whatever evidence we can on the cost of this, so that we can try to get as close to fair funding as is possible in the current climate for implementing this.
So I've got a question here about what do we do if there isn't a barcode on the product being dispensed? Of course, for a product to be an FMD product, it needs to have both of the safety features. It needs to have the anti-tamper device, and it also needs to have the unique identifier, which is at the minimum a 2D barcode, and it normally has the human readable form as well. So if it doesn't have those features, and remember that the 2D barcode will be on a low reflectivity background, if it doesn't have those features, then it isn't FMD, and you can just carry on as you are now for those products.
Okay, well, I'll pick up a question about packs that are used for more than one patient, so broken bulk, MDS situations. So the legislation here recognises that situation and states that you must check the safety features the first time you use any pack, and then you don't need to do subsequent checks when you use that pack, potentially for different patients. So it will be important to mark the pack in some way to indicate that it's been scanned, because if you scan it a second time, there's a potential for triggering an alert. System could pick it up as a potential counterfeit. It would only be an alert, but that number will have been through the database twice. So you need to try to avoid doing that. But the legislation does recognise that situation, and it does have a solution for that situation.
So I've got a question here about why is pharmacy omeprazole, that's non-prescription omeprazole in pharmacy, also included in these regulations? And the answer, that's the whim of the EU, and it pertains to a particular appendix of the regulations, and it was added because there was a suspected falsification elsewhere in Europe.
Yeah, that is absolutely an anomaly. I'm sure people could think of other OTC medicines that are more likely to be counterfeited, but as John said, it was this. Well, the EU put together a risk assessment, and it just so happened that omeprazole came up as being high risk because of that incident. So that's a slightly unusual one. A question here about why can't wholesalers do this? So I think when the system was set up, and it's set up European-wide, we have same regulations for every pharmacy in Europe. It was set up as what's known as a bookend system. So this is not a track and trace system. We can't tell where the pack is after it's left the manufacturer until it's dispensed. And that is so the bookend system is a cheaper way of putting in place a serialization and authentication system, but it does need to the authentication to take place as close to the patient as is possible, and therefore it's pharmacy across Europe. All 150,000 pharmacies across Europe have this obligation to do the scan. The wholesalers do have some obligations of their own, and for example, if a pack is returned from a pharmacy to a wholesaler, they have to do what's called risk-based scanning. Also, if they're using new wholesalers, they would have to do some scanning as well. But most of the routine scanning is done at pharmacy level. I mean, another factor here is that pharmacy handles packs at an individual level, where a lot of the manufacturing units are handling packs in a bulk level. Yeah, I mean, that's a common frustration. But that is the way the system has been set up across the EU. So that's how we have to work.
So there's a question here about what happens if a patient rejects an item which they've opened in front of you. Can it be returned to the wholesaler? It's a difficult one. I mean, often you have a pack of medicines in a bag that the patient says that they don't need, and if it's within the 10 days, then clearly the pack can be undecommissioned, reverted if you prefer, and can be put back in stock. But if the pack has been opened, I think it's probably very dubious that you can use that at all. I don't think you can, and certainly the wholesaler's not going to want it back.
Okay, and I can see a question here about that is, if we decommission when the stock enters the pharmacy, do we need to decommission when the stock is given out? And the answer to that is yes. So there's a little bit of, so actually the legislation, we wouldn't actually put up the precise words of the legislation, but it requires the safety checks to be performed at the time of supply to patients. And regulators are not going to interpret that very, very strictly, because I think if they did, that would require us to undertake a highly onerous scanning in front of every single patient, which would just be completely impractical. So I think it looks likely to be regarded as acceptable to scan whilst you're assembling the medicine. But to scan at point of entry to pharmacy isn't close enough to the patient to be acceptable to regulators. You might be doing the scan weeks or months before the patient actually receives the medicine. So you could set up your system to do a scan at point of entry, and that may help with stock control, for example. You make use of these additional features that we have on packs, but that won't discharge your duties under FMD. You will still need to be doing a scan when you're allocated that pack to an individual patient. So if you want to scan at point of entry, you'll have to do a second scan. And that might work for some people for the stock management benefits if the system is set up in that way. But I don't think that's what most people will do. I think they will stick with one scan at the point of assembly.
So there's a question here. Can you change software supplier without having to onboard again that's registration with SecureMed? And the answer is you don't have to onboard again. You can just use your current registration, and your credentials will be usable with the different software supplier.
So there's a question here about whether FMD is already operating anywhere else in the world. Are we all going live at the same time? Well, FMD is operational for the 28 countries currently of the EU, and some other countries in the EA, so like Norway and Iceland and Switzerland. So they're all using FMD. There are equivalent systems. There is one in the US, and I think in all likelihood, other systems will be introduced in other countries around the world. But within the EU and also the EEA countries, yes, everybody does go live on the 9th of February 2019. And on that date, every manufacturer will have their obligations, wholesalers will have their obligations, and pharmacy will have our obligations. But just because of the way the supply chain works, we as I mentioned earlier, it will take time for lots of the stock to trickle down the system to pharmacy level. So whilst we have the legal obligations from that date, well, we only expect to see a very small number of packs initially. Now, I think it could take years actually before every pack in a community pharmacy is within scope of this directive, and that's an additional problem really, because we'll have two systems running. We'll have to think about some products that need to be scanned and some products that don't. But that's just the reality of introducing the system, unfortunately.
So I've got a question here. If an alert comes back as a red alert on the system, an error message, and you can't dispense the pack, how does community pharmacy get compensated? So we have to drill down and look at the different causes of the red alert, the bad response, negative response. So, for instance, if it was due to the pack being out of date, beyond its expiry date, I'm sure that's a cost that the pharmacy has to bear. If the red beep was caused by scanning the same pack more than once, that's just an operational problem locally, and is not a cause for concern other than maybe the SOPs aren't quite right. If the pack has been recalled, then I believe there are recall procedures where you would hope to eventually get reimbursed. If it was a status error with the pack marked as stolen, for instance, you might hope that there'd be some process for that. If, however, it was a status error due to it being marked as a free sample or exported or destroyed, it seems very dubious you'd get any compensation. There's another 3 of these, bear with me. So if there was a data error, that the data wasn't found in the NMVS, in the database records, then I'm sure it's a cause for concern. Whether you end up getting compensated, I'm not sure. If it was already used elsewhere, then this is exactly the sort of case that the system is made to detect, and it indicates possible falsification or a duplicate elsewhere, either in this country or in another EU country with the same unique identifier. And this is one of the cases where MHRA would be interested, if not excited, and you would hope that either they would request the item from you as a sample, in which case you would be compensated, or they could confiscate it, in which case you wouldn't. I understand they haven't quite decided yet. Last one is that you can get a red indication if the pack is locked. Now, you shouldn't see any of those, but they might happen temporarily while a manufacturer looks into whether something has gone wrong with a particular batch. So that's it.
Okay, so we also have a question about missing the 10-day window to recommission an unused pack back into stock. So many of the software systems will be set up in such a way that actually the 10-day rule doesn't really become relevant, because you scan as you assemble the pack. You create a bag label which links to all those numbers inside the bag, and so the numbers are recorded. The scan's taking place, and numbers are recorded in your system, but they're not sent for decommissioning until the patient arrives in the pharmacy and you scan the bag, and so therefore you're not really taking any risks with the 10-day rule, because you don't really even start the clock until the patient arrives. If you're not operating that system, then you do have a risk with the 10-day rule. If you have dispensed something, signed it to a patient, decommissioned it on the system, and not supplied it for 10 days, or realised that actually it was 2 weeks ago that you put it through the system, and it's obvious now to you that the patient isn't coming. The regulations actually say it can't be returned to saleable stock. We have asked the Department of Health to just to confirm that one for us, because that would suggest therefore that the stock would have to be written off, and the value of it would be lost, and that the pharmacy would bear the cost of that. So we are seeking clarification on that one, and we'll update people as soon as we get more information. But the 10-day rule, it can be circumvented essentially with IT.
There's a question here: what if I supply to a clinic without a wholesale license a small amount? That's a difficult question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. Have you got any idea on that one, Gareth?
No. I think we'll follow that one up after the webinar, so we'll try and get a better answer for that one to circulate afterwards. Okay, I'm just... we've obviously done a lot of the questions that people have asked. I'm just seeing if there are any more here that we haven't dealt with. So we've got a question here: if you're in a pharmacy where you deblister most of your medicines, then would medication need to be decommissioned prior to assigning them to patients? Yes, if you're if you're opening blisters, you decommission on the very first occasion. So the legislation does not require you to make a record of which pack went to which patient. It just requires you to decommission individual packs before any supply is made to a patient. So on those packs, you just check the safety features, decommission at the point you first use that pack.
So there's a question about specials. Specials aren't covered by FMD.
Okay, I think just flicking through, actually, there are an awful lot of questions here. We'll just bear with us a minute. We're just trying to see if there are any others that we haven't been able to answer. How do you differentiate stock already in the pharmacy and stock that comes in? Well, in a way, it's not so much the stock that's in the pharmacy on the 9th of February, because we know we're going to get more stock after that date that is out of scope of FMD. So in most cases, it's obvious that something is in scope of FMD. It's got the tamper evidence seal, it will have the 2D barcode, and it will have the non-reflective background, which is not the case with some other packs which might have a 2D barcode. So in most cases, it will be very obvious whether something is in FMD or not in FMD. There are a few anomalies that we'll have to deal with, but in most cases, it'll be pretty obvious.
And there's a question here, can you move stock between branches? And the answer is, for stock that hasn't been decommissioned, you can move it between branches within the UK. It's maybe more dubious if you've got branches on both sides of the Northern Ireland border, which would be between EU countries.
There's a question here about actually decommissioning in front of patients. Well, if there's a problem with the pack, they're going to assume medicines are falsified, and that isn't very professional. And certainly, agree there are some problems in that scenario. But I mean, I think once the system is up and running, there are almost certainly going to be teething problems. There are going to be packs that are coming up with alerts simply because the numbers haven't been put into the database. That's just one example of things that will go wrong at the start. But we would anticipate when this is operating and it's become business as usual, it's going to be fairly rare that there'll be an alert on any pack. So the system has been designed, I suppose, to work in most of the pharmacies in Europe where they actually don't do dispensing in advance. So the model in most European countries is that patients arrive with a prescription and it is dispensed in front of them. And countries like Belgium, for example, has had a system in place for a number of years where they've been able to use it without too many of those problems. So I think ultimately it should be fairly straightforward, but I think we will definitely have a difficult period as we get used to it, but also as the non-compliant packs work their way through the system.
I've got a couple of questions here. Is there a cost to registering with SecureMed? No, there isn't a cost to registering with SecureMed for community pharmacies or for other endpoints like that. The central system within the UK is being paid for by manufacturers and wholesalers. And the next one, which is sorry, hang on a moment.
I've got one here, John. So how long can you stretch the existing stocks for? Is there a deadline for it to be used up? So no, there isn't. If you've got stock that was legitimately put into the medicine supply chain before the 9th of February 2019, as long as it is in date, that's fine to use. So there's no need to use up stock that you've got in your pharmacy at the moment or that you received after the date. of the 9th of February.
All right, and I found that second question I was looking for. Is it an issue if non-FMD compliant stock is scanned by error? Most systems will give you an amber light indicating not FMD stock. It's one of a number of conditions that can give you an amber light. Of course, non-FMD stock can just be dispensed as normal, and you can ignore the amber warning in that case.
A question here about whether suppliers scanned to aggregate into a tote box, for example. So could we verify the whole tote box? And unfortunately, that just simply won't comply with the regulation. The regulation requires us to not only authenticate at the pharmacy level, but to do it pretty close to where the supply to the patient is made. So scanning a tote as it comes into the pharmacy and believing that that's going to be enough to meet the legislation is just not correct, I'm afraid. So this has to be done really at patient level when stock is allocated to a patient.
There's a question here. What's the procedure if you find you have counterfeit stock? So, for instance, the FMD system gives you a red alert saying that the stock has already been used elsewhere. So the procedure would be that you would maybe have a local investigation to first check that you were really sure that was what your system was telling you and it wasn't telling you something else. And once you were sure, you would phone the MHRA Defective Medicine Helpline, or you would fill in the an entry on the yellow card online portal.
We have a question here. So what do we have to do now? Is it just register with SecureMed? Do we have to start using the scanner fully from the 9th of February 2019? Legally, you actually have to have the system in place, but if you haven't started, you're probably going to struggle to do that. But we'd advise people to make as much progress as you can by the 9th of February 2019, and you've obviously got staff training that needs to be done, SOPs that the MPA can provide from you, as well as getting the software in place. I think that's our advice, really. Make as much progress as you can. The last part of the question, do we have to use the scanner fully from the 9th of February 2019? You use it from that date onwards for any stock that is within the scope of FMD.
So there's a question here. Does the anti-tamper device need to be checked directly before supply to the public? For example, would it be suitable and acceptable to FMD law to package up a medicine 2 days prior and not do a second check? So we, during in the way forward document, we talked about the checking of the anti-tamper device and the decommissioning of the unique identifier. Ideally, both of them are done just at the moment before handover to the patient. However, realistically, this isn't going to happen like that. So it's fine to check the anti-tamper device sometime after you've picked it, to sometime between when you picked it and when you hand it over to the patient. And similarly, the decommissioning of the pack also happens sometime between when you've picked it and sometime between when you've handed it over to the patient. And they don't necessarily have to be at the same moment in time either.
Okay, well, I think we're running out of time, so we'll just do a few more questions. What happens if a product is dispensed at a time when there is an internet outage, and then we later find out the product was non-compliant? It's recognised for a start that the systems will go down. So just because you haven't got a current internet link to the database doesn't mean you have to stop dispensing. You carry on as normal. Your system should record those numbers, and they can then be sent to the database when your connection is operational again. Theoretically, of course, you might have dispensed something in that period that will generate an alert. I mean, I think if that occurs, the professional thing to do is to depend on exactly what the alert is, but to try to track down the patient. But I don't think you need to worry that will happen very often. Once the system is running normally and all the teething problems have been removed, I think the likelihood of you retrospectively finding a serious problem with a pack after it's left the pharmacy is pretty remote. So I don't think that's going to be a regular occurrence, but it's certainly a theoretical possibility that would happen.
So I've got a question here. What happens if the barcode is damaged and cannot be read by the scanner? If the pack is severely damaged, maybe it ought to have been sent back to the wholesaler rather than being accepted into stock. But if the barcode is just damaged and the human readable form of the unique identifier, those 4 fields, is readable, most of the FMD systems will have a manual data entry system where you can type those in manually rather than scanning the barcode, although it will be laborious and very difficult for anything but the smallest of quantities.
Okay, I'll take one more question and then perhaps I'll hand over to John for the last question. There's one here about parallel import products. Will FMD only apply to PI packs at the beginning? Well, so any packs that you've got that are in the supply chain before the 9th of February are compliant anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. And then PI packs after that date will be part of the system. So if an importer brings some stock in from Spain, for example, they will decommission all of that stock from the Spanish database. They'll repackage in the UK and they'll put it onto the UK database then. So when that stock reaches you in a UK pharmacy, you should scan that in a normal way, and that serial number will be confirmed on the UK database. So PI packs have been considered, and it should operate more or less in the same way that non-PI packs operate.
So I know we've mentioned it already, but there seems to be an awful lot of questions about MDS and split packs. So I'll just reiterate that the procedure is you have a prescription in front of you that needs you to split a pack or to open a bulk pack. You check the anti-tamper device on the bottle or pack is intact. You can then scan the barcode, the unique identifier, and check that it can be decommissioned properly. You can then open the packet, use the 7 tablets out of it that you need for one tray, and you can keep all the rest for later, and you would probably want to mark the pack in some way to show that it was already decommissioned so that you didn't double scan it.
Okay, and just one very last quick question. Do you need to register with SecureMed if you have a wholesaler dealer's license as well as a pharmacy? So the answer there is yes, you have to register with SecureMed both as a pharmacy and as a wholesaler. So two registrations with SecureMed if you hold 2 different licenses. So John, will you go through the resources, please?
I will. Hopefully you can see that slide, the vital resources. So the MPA FMD page has a brief guide to FMD. Is your PMR right for you? That includes the contract warnings that apply to not only to PMR systems but also to FMD standalone systems. And there's also a standalone system comparison table where I think we've got 6 or 7 standalone systems that we've compared. And there's now also the SOPs that have been amended for FMD. On FMD source, we've got the way forward document for FMD in community pharmacy, and I recommend that one as a good read. And there's far more information on the FMD source website as well. On securemed.org.uk, that has the official list of FMD suppliers, although you'll also find it on FMD Source. It also, of course, SecureMed has the end user registration. Also, the MHRA has a page which has got a lot of links to other sites, which is very useful. And then lastly, on there, I've got a link to the actual regulations themselves, which are downloadable as a PDF. And that's it from me.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. So just a reminder then that tonight's webinar has been recorded, so if you did miss any parts, then you can still see them. The login details that you had will allow you to access the recording. So we managed to get through quite a lot of questions, but we'll go through the full list tomorrow and get an email out to everyone who registered for the webinar to make sure that all of the questions have been answered. So John's mentioned the resources on particularly the MPA website and FMD Source website have lots of useful information, and obviously the MPA itself. We can carry on answering other questions that you have through the phone line or emailing pharmacy services with any other questions that you have. So finally, thank you for joining us this evening. I hope it was useful and gave you hopefully a fair amount of the information that you need to implement FMD over the next few weeks. So thank you very much and good night.